we're now in a position to begin to explore Derrida's metaphysics, and to do so by looking at one of the most famous sayings he ever wrote. There's nothing outside the text. First thing to say is that it's not a saying at all. It's not a big conclusion that he builds up to. It comes in the flow of an argument in the text of grammatology, and a lot of weight has been hung on this particular phrase, and it has to be said a lot of misunderstanding accrues around it as well. So I want to try and take it slowly, explain what Derrida means by there's nothing outside the text, and hopefully use that as a way to lead into a broader discussion of his metaphysics. I'm going to work with the sentence in French because the English translation does its best to make it incomprehensible. In French, it's il n'y a pas de hors texte, which if you translated it literally back into English would end up with something like there is no outside text. So then, question is, what is Derrida claiming? And equally importantly, given the way that this has been received, what is he not claiming when he says il n'y a pas de hors texte? Let's break it down, take it piece by piece. First of all, what is un hors texte? It is a noun. There is a thing in French called a hors texte, and it's important to know what it is in order to understand this phrase. Un hors texte is a book frontispiece or a book plate. It's often an image, sometimes a photograph that's stuck into a book, often on better quality paper than the book is printed itself. The example that I've given there on the screen is on the same quality paper, but as you can see, it's an image that stands outside the text of the book before the title page, so it stands outside the text. And what is the function of such an hors texte, of such an image or a piece of text outside the main body of the text? Well, it can have certain different functions, can't it? It can be an image, as in this case on the slide here, that illustrates a particularly important moment or a particularly important theme from the book that it's stuck in the front of. Sometimes it can be an ex libris plate that tells you who owns the book, where it belongs. Sometimes it can be an illustration that evokes the atmosphere of the book. Now, in each of these cases, what the hors texte is doing is it's giving you a context or giving you a steer to understand the book. It's telling you who owns it, or it's showing you what's really important in it, or it's picking out a particularly key event from the book. It's helping you to interpret the book even before you've started reading it. And so these hors texte, in a sense, then stand outside and above the text as a sort of authority over the text, enabling themselves to tell you what it means or to point you in a particular direction in relation to your reading of the text. So, when Derrida claims il n'y a pas de hors texte, one thing that he's saying is, in our experience of the world, there is no such book plate. There is no such word or image that comes before the to and fro of everyday life to point you in a particular direction as to its interpretation, to tell you what it means, to tell you who it belongs to. There's nothing that stands outside our experience to show us how to interpret our experience. So that's an hors texte. The second thing that needs to be clarified is what Derrida means by text at all. He's often been taken to mean books and writing. So when people hear there's nothing outside the text, they think Derrida means nothing exists apart from words written down in books, which would be silly, wouldn't it? He means something much broader by text. Let me give you his own gloss of the term. He says, what I call text implies all the structures called real, economic, historical, socio-institutional. In short, all possible reference. So what he means is that something is a text if it is a structure of meaning, a structure of language, and a way of understanding the world in a particular context. So he gives us, for example, here the economic and the historical as contexts. When we talk historically, we have certain structures that make sense of certain things that we say. Certain words have particular meanings within that way of talking about the world. And so what Derrida is saying is that there's nothing outside these structures of meaning, these ways we have grids, if you like, for understanding the world. There's no absolute meanings that sort of hover outside all our systems for understanding things in some sort of pure, abstract, eternal world, waiting to be called down into our structures of meaning. It's those structures themselves that make sense of all possible reference and that make all possible reference possible. Quick footnote, here he's rejecting what we could think of as a Platonic idea. You know from the introductory lecture on the death of God that Plato has this idea that everything that exists in two separate worlds. There's the messy world of change that we experience with our senses, and then there's the pure world of eternal ideas or forms. One thing that Derrida is saying here is that there is no such world of ideas or forms. There's just the world that we experience. Nothing that can reach into that from the outside and give it a definite meaning like Plato's ideas can. So that's text. Thirdly, it's important to understand what Derrida means and what he doesn't mean with his there is, il y a in French. Because although we use the words there is in a very casual way and we don't mean much specific by them apart from, look over there or see what I've noticed, the idea there is, that the form of language there is, has a quite specific meaning within modern European thought, and Derrida is resonating with that in Il n'y a pas de hors texte. It all comes from the German philosopher Martin Heidegger and his notion in German of the es gibt, which is German for there is. Literally translated, it would be there gives. Now, for Heidegger, the world offers itself to our consciousness. In other words, we can understand it in terms of particular concepts. Let me give you two examples. I'm looking now in front of me on the desk at a mug of warm tea. It was hot tea before I started this video, but I'm afraid it's warm tea now. Now, when I look at that mug, you could say that what I'm actually seeing is a huge concatenation of atoms at a particular temperature with different wavelengths of light striking my retina, and it's a huge jumble of sensory information. But that isn't what I see, is it? I see a cup of coffee or tea. And I think that's comforting. That'll help me to record this video because I'll be slightly stimulated if I've had a cup of tea. It speaks comfort to me, it speaks warmth to me, it speaks familiarity and a whole lot of other things as well. So I see it as a cup of tea. What strikes my retina may well be a series of jumbled impressions, but what I see is a cup of tea. I experience it as a cup of tea, and that's what Heidegger calls the as structure of being. Being presents itself to us as certain things. Another example would be if you're working away in your office and you hear a police siren outside. You experience it not as a disorientating, inexplicable, shrill noise, but you immediately give it a particular cultural context. You experience it as a police siren. And for Heidegger, we can't really get behind this way that we experience the world around us already neatly packaged up in concepts. I just do experience the thing on the desk in front of me as a cup of tea. And so when Derrida is using this French il y a, which is the French translation of the German es gibt, he's drawing on this sense of the world giving itself to me. Il n'y a pas de hors texte. The world does not present itself to me in terms of the concepts in which I understand it as outside the text. Okay, now let's try and drag all that together and expand il n'y a pas de hors texte, to paraphrase it in a way that puts all these meanings in it. Here's my suggestion. When Derrida says il n'y a pas de hors texte, what he means is this. Nothing is present to my consciousness as what it is. Okay, that's the as structure of being. I look at the cup of tea, I see it as a cup of tea, not as some random atoms, in a way that stands authoritatively over and above the different structures of meaning that make up my experience. That's the idea of the hors text, standing outside and above the book in order to guide our interpretation of it. There's nothing outside the structures of meaning that make up my experience that gives itself to my consciousness. Now, you will admit that that is not as catchy as in Yeped hors text, and certainly not as catchy or controversial as there is nothing outside the text. But that is what it means. And therefore, of course, it doesn't mean that the only thing that exists is words written down in books, as some people have tried to make Derrida say in more fanciful moments. We can try and represent it diagrammatically. If you're the sort of person who thinks in terms of images, this might be helpful to you. The big black rectangular box here is our experience of the world, everything that gives itself to our experience in terms of our five senses, everything that we can know. There's nothing outside of this. For the purposes of this diagram, there is no space outside of this rectangle. And what we have inside it is a circulation, if you like, a passing on from meaning to meaning, from word to word. Think of it as a dictionary. When I look up a word in the dictionary, what do I find? I find other words. The meaning of a particular word is outsourced, if you like, to a group of other words to try and make sense of it. And then I can look up those other words in turn, and their meaning is outsourced to more words. And it's a circulation of meaning. I can pass from word to word, seeking to understand what it means, and I will never reach a point that's outside the dictionary. I'll never find some undefinable, non-dictionary word to anchor the circulation of all the different meanings of the dictionary in its different definitions. Now, don't push that analogy too far, but it is useful for understanding this circulation of meanings within experience, within different structures for Derrida. What there isn't is what he calls in grammatology a transcendental signified. All that means is a concept that stands outside this circulation of meanings, a non-dictionary word. If there were such a thing, it could act as a still anchor point, as some sort of solid ground from which we could look out from the outside at the circulation of meanings. But as far as Derrida is concerned, there is no such place. There is no transcendental signified.